It's 1991. A man sits in his office holding a pen that will dissolve the world's largest country with a single signature. That man is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's about to end the Soviet Union, a superpower that once controlled 1/6 of the world's land surface and challenged America for global dominance. But how did we get here? How did an empire that started with a group of revolutionaries hiding in basements become a nuclear superpower, then collapse in just 69 years? Today, we're going to tell the complete story of the Soviet Union, from its bloody birth in revolution to its peaceful death by paperwork. And trust me, this journey is more dramatic than any Hollywood movie. Before we dive in, let's set the stage. Imagine the Soviet Union as a massive experiment, like trying to build the world's most ambitious startup. But instead of disrupting the tech industry, they wanted to disrupt, well, everything. Capitalism, democracy, religion, even the concept of private property. This experiment lasted from 1922 to 1991. And it affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people. At its peak, the USSR was home to over 290 million citizens spread across 15 different republics, from the Baltic states in Europe to the frozen wilderness of Siberia. The story we're about to tell isn't just about politics and economics, it's about human nature, ambition, fear, and the eternal question, can you force paradise into existence? So, buckle up, because we're about to witness the rise and fall of one of history's most fascinating and controversial empires.
But seizing power in the capital was just the beginning. What followed was one of the most brutal civil wars in human history, lasting from 1918 to 1921. Picture Russia as a giant family dinner where everyone suddenly starts fighting, except instead of throwing food, they're throwing artillery shells. On one side, you had the Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters. On the other side, the Whites, a loose coalition of everyone who opposed the Bolsheviks, including monarchists, Democrats, and foreign interventionist forces. The scale of this conflict was mind-boggling. It wasn't just a war, it was societal collapse. Imagine if a civil war in the United States also included foreign armies from 14 different countries, plus roving bands of anarchists, plus a complete breakdown of the economy, plus a deadly flu pandemic. That's what Russia experienced. During this chaos, Lenin implemented war communism, essentially a command economy on steroids. The government took control of all major industries, eliminated private trade, and requisitioned grain from peasants by force. It was like trying to manage the entire country like a single giant corporation, with bureaucrats in Moscow making decisions about everything from steel production to bread distribution. The results were catastrophic. Industrial production plummeted, cities emptied as people fled to the countryside, and famine killed millions. It was like economic shock therapy, except the patient nearly died on the table. By 1921, even Lenin realized they were pushing too hard, too fast. He introduced the new economic policy, or NEP, essentially allowing some private business and free markets back into the economy. Lenin called it one step back to take 2 steps forward. Think of it like this. If war communism was trying to force everyone to switch to a completely new smartphone overnight, NEP was admitting that maybe they should let people keep using their old phones while gradually introducing new features. It worked. By the mid-1920s, the economy was recovering, agricultural production increased, and some stability returned. But this created a new problem. Was the Soviet Union becoming more capitalist or more communist?
When Lenin died in 1924, he left behind a power vacuum and a warning. In his political testament, he specifically cautioned against Joseph Stalin, describing him as too crude and power-hungry.
It was like a dying CEO leaving a note saying, "Whatever you do, don't let the guy from accounting run the company." But Stalin was brilliant at office politics. While other leaders like Leon Trotsky gave inspiring speeches and wrote theoretical papers, Stalin was busy building networks, placing allies in key positions, and understanding that in politics, relationships matter more than ideas. By 1929, Stalin had outmaneuvered all his rivals. Trotsky was in exile, and Stalin controlled the Soviet Union with an iron grip. Stalin's vision was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its ruthlessness. He wanted to transform the Soviet Union from a peasant society into an industrial superpower in just one decade. "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries," he declared. "We must make up this gap in 10 years. The first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, was like trying to build the entire industrial revolution in fast-forward mode. Massive factories rose from the ground, new cities appeared overnight, and millions of peasants were forced to become industrial workers. The propaganda was everywhere. The 5-year plan in 4 years. Workers were portrayed as heroes, and production targets were treated like military objectives. Imagine if your boss said, "We're going to triple our company's output this year, and anyone who doesn't meet their quota is a traitor." But Stalin was brilliant at office politics. While other leaders like Leon Trotsky gave inspiring speeches and wrote theoretical papers, Stalin was busy building networks, placing allies in key positions, and understanding that in politics, relationships matter more than ideas. By 1929, Stalin had outmaneuvered all his rivals. Trotsky was in exile, and Stalin controlled the Soviet Union with an iron grip. Stalin's vision was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its ruthlessness. He wanted to transform the Soviet Union from a peasant society into an industrial superpower in just one decade. "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries," he declared. "We must make up this gap in 10 years." The first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, was like trying to build the entire industrial revolution in fast-forward mode. Massive factories rose from the ground, new cities appeared overnight, and millions of peasants were forced to become industrial workers. The propaganda was everywhere. The 5-year plan in 4 years. Workers were portrayed as heroes, and production targets were treated like military objectives. Imagine if your boss said, "We're going to triple our company's output this year, and anyone who doesn't meet their quota is a traitor." But Stalin's most controversial policy was collectivization, forcing millions of individual farmers to give up their land and work on large collective farms controlled by the state. This wasn't just economic policy, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The resistance was fierce, especially from the kulaks, relatively prosperous peasants who had thrived under NEP. Stalin's response was characteristically brutal. "We must smash the kulaks as a class." Between deportations, executions, and deliberate famine, millions died. The Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, known as the Holodomor, was particularly devastating. Imagine a government that takes away all the food from an entire region, then prevents people from leaving or receiving outside aid. Modern historians estimate that 3 to 5 million Ukrainians died of starvation. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had achieved his economic goals. The Soviet Union was indeed becoming an industrial power, but success bred paranoia. Stalin began to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest allies. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 was like a horror movie where the monster is invisible paranoia. Old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution were tortured into confessing to fantastic crimes they never committed. Military leaders were executed just as war with Germany was approaching. Ordinary citizens were arrested for telling jokes about the government. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that during Stalin's rule, somewhere between 6 and 20 million Soviet citizens died from executions, forced labor, and deliberate famines. It's hard to comprehend this scale of human suffering. Yet here's what makes this story complex. Many Soviet citizens genuinely believed they were building something magnificent. Despite the terror, there were real achievements. Literacy rates soared, women gained opportunities that were unavailable elsewhere, and the Soviet Union was becoming a major industrial power. For many people, especially those from peasant backgrounds, Soviet society offered unprecedented opportunities for education and advancement. A farmer's son could become an engineer. A factory worker's daughter could become a doctor. The Soviet Union created a social mobility that was remarkable for its time.
On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3.5 million Axis troops crossed the Soviet border. For Stalin, who had desperately tried to avoid this war, it was like waking up to find your worst nightmare had become reality. The initial German advance was devastating. Imagine a chess game where your opponent captures most of your pieces in the first few moves. Within months, German forces had captured vast territories, including Ukraine's agricultural heartland and major industrial centers. But Hitler made a crucial miscalculation. He expected the Soviet Union to collapse like a rotten structure, as he put it. Instead, he awakened something profound in the Soviet people. Not just communist ideology, but Russian patriotism and the basic human instinct for survival. The Battle of Stalingrad became the turning point of World War II and perhaps of the 20th century. From August 1942 to February 1943, two massive armies fought for control of this strategic city in the most brutal urban warfare imaginable. Picture Stalingrad as a giant meat grinder, where soldiers fought for every building, every room, sometimes every staircase. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was just 24 hours. Snipers hunted each other through the rubble like deadly games of hide-and-seek. When the Germans finally surrendered, they had lost an entire army, over 200,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. It was like watching the seemingly invincible champion get knocked out by someone everyone had written off. The Soviet Union's victory in World War II came at an unimaginable cost. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens died. That's roughly 1 in 8 people. To put this in perspective, the United States lost about 400,000 people in the entire war. The Soviet Union lost more people in the siege of Leningrad alone than America did in the entire conflict. But they won. By May 1945, Soviet tanks were rolling through Berlin, and the USSR had emerged as one of the world's 2 superpowers. Stalin, once dismissed by Hitler as leading a nation of peasants, was now sitting at the table with Churchill and Roosevelt, carving up post-war Europe.
The alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was always a marriage of convenience, like two rival companies temporarily cooperating to defeat a common competitor. Once Hitler was gone, the fundamental ideological differences between capitalism and communism reasserted themselves. By 1947, the Cold War had begun. It wasn't a traditional war with armies clashing, but rather a global chess match played with nuclear weapons, spy networks, and proxy conflicts. The world became divided into two camps, with the Soviet Union leading the communist bloc against the American-led capitalist world. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, ending America's atomic monopoly. Suddenly, the world had two superpowers capable of destroying human civilization. It was like giving two angry neighbors the ability to blow up the entire neighborhood. The arms race that followed was both terrifying and absurd. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union and United States together possessed over 60,000 nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the world several times over. They were like two gunslingers who kept adding more and bigger guns until they each had enough firepower to level the entire town. But the Cold War wasn't just about military might. It was about proving which system was superior. And nowhere was this more dramatic than in space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Americans looked up at the night sky and saw a Soviet star passing overhead, a powerful symbol that maybe capitalism wasn't automatically superior to communism. The Soviets followed up with a series of space firsts. First animal in space, first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, first woman in space. Each achievement was a propaganda victory that resonated around the world. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev gradually emerged as the new Soviet leader. In 1956, he delivered a secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes. It was like a company CEO admitting that the previous management had been completely corrupt. Khrushchev promised peaceful coexistence with the West and improvements in Soviet living standards. He famously told Americans, "We will bury you," but he meant economically, not militarily. His vision was that communism would prove its superiority by providing a better life for ordinary people. For a while, it seemed to work. The Soviet economy was growing rapidly, living standards were improving, and the space program was achieving spectacular successes. Many people around the world wondered if maybe the Soviet model was the future. But by the 1970s, under Leonid Brezhnev's leadership, the Soviet system was beginning to show its age. Like a car that had been driven hard for decades, problems were starting to appear everywhere. The economy was becoming increasingly inefficient. Central planning worked well for basic industrialization, but struggled with the complexity of a modern economy. Innovation slowed, consumer goods remained scarce, and black markets flourished. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was getting drawn into costly foreign adventures, including a disastrous war in Afghanistan that many historians now call the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced a perfect storm of problems. The economy was stagnating, the military was overstretched, and a new generation of leaders in the West, particularly Ronald Reagan, was ramping up the pressure. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he was like a new CEO brought in to save a failing company. He knew that dramatic changes were necessary, but he may not have realized just how fragile the entire system had become. Gorbachev introduced two key policies that would ultimately doom the Soviet Union: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allowed more free speech and press freedom, while perestroika aimed to reform the economy by introducing some market mechanisms. Gorbachev's reforms were like trying to renovate a house while people are living in it. Once you start tearing down walls, you might discover that some of them were load-bearing. The Soviet system had been held together by fear, ideology, and economic dependency. Once those bonds began to weaken, everything started to unravel. Glasnost unleashed decades of suppressed grievances. People began openly discussing Stalin's crimes, questioning communist ideology, and demanding greater freedoms. The various ethnic republics started asserting their independence, and even within Russia itself, support for the communist system began to collapse. The most dramatic evidence of the Soviet Union's declining power came in 1989, when communist governments across Eastern Europe began falling like dominoes. The Berlin Wall, that powerful symbol of the Cold War division, was torn down by ordinary citizens with hammers and crowbars. Gorbachev faced a crucial choice: use military force to maintain the Soviet Union, or let these countries choose their own path. Unlike his predecessors who had crushed uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Gorbachev chose not to intervene. It was a morally admirable decision that also signaled the end of Soviet power in Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. Several republics had declared independence, the economy was in freefall, and Gorbachev's authority was evaporating. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup to save the Soviet Union. For 3 tense days, tanks surrounded the Russian parliament building, while Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, led the resistance. The coup failed, partly because the military refused to fire on civilians, and partly because the Soviet system no longer had the legitimacy to command obedience. It was like watching the final scene of a movie where the villain realizes that no one is afraid of him anymore.
On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television to announce his resignation as president of a country that would cease to exist the next day. It was one of the most surreal moments in modern history, the leader of the world's second-largest superpower essentially announcing that his country was going out of business. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which had once seemed eternal, vanished overnight. 15 new independent countries were born from its ashes. What went wrong? So what killed the Soviet Union? It wasn't a military defeat or a natural disaster. It was more like a slow-motion implosion caused by the accumulation of systemic problems. The centrally planned economy, which had worked for rapid industrialization, couldn't adapt to the complexity of the modern world. The political system, based on the monopoly of a single party, couldn't handle the demands for freedom and democracy that emerged in the modern era. Perhaps most importantly, the Soviet Union lost the battle of ideas. By the 1980s, most Soviet citizens no longer believed that communism would deliver the prosperity and freedom it had promised. When a system loses legitimacy, it becomes surprisingly fragile. The Soviet Union's legacy is complex and controversial. On one hand, it was responsible for enormous human suffering. Millions died from purges, famines, and political repression. The promise of a worker's paradise became, for many, a worker's nightmare. But the Soviet Union also achieved remarkable things. It transformed a peasant society into an industrial superpower, defeated Nazi Germany, pioneered space exploration, and provided education and opportunities to millions of people who would never have had them under the old system.
The story of the Soviet Union is ultimately a story about human ambition and human limitations. It shows us both what people can achieve when they're united by a common purpose and what happens when good intentions are combined with unlimited power and flawed ideas. The Soviet experiment failed, but it left us with important questions that we're still grappling with today. How much equality should we sacrifice for freedom? How much freedom should we sacrifice for security? Can any political system deliver on its promises, or are we doomed to be perpetually disappointed by our leaders? The Soviet Union lasted 69 years, not long in historical terms, but long enough to shape the lives of hundreds of millions of people and to change the course of world history. Its rise and fall reminds us that no matter how permanent any system might seem, everything is temporary, everything can change, and the future is always uncertain. That's the complete story of the Soviet Union, from revolution to superpower to memory. What do you think? Was it a noble experiment that went wrong, or was it doomed from the beginning? Let me know in the comments below.
Thanks for watching. If you love this document presentation, please subscribe for more History Document Update. Good luck!